you wrote an article to switch gears a little bit recently about the top newcomer for every Big Ten team. And as somebody who's writing previews for Michigan's opponents here for our preview magazine, I appreciate this because there are so many new names. I'm currently working on the Washington preview right now. They have 2 returning starters. Everyone's different. It's like Jed Fish brought Arizona over to Washington. So it's really hard to track, but it's a great article just to look at, okay, who's going to be the new guy. And I know you provided some bonuses as well of other guys on these teams that are going to be new faces that'll make impacts. But you put Jayshawn Barham, the junior linebacker for Michigan, a Maryland transfer who is really athletic, a guy who wreaked a little bit of havoc against Michigan last year, intercepting J.J. McCarthy in the end zone, kind of made that thing a game at halftime. What do you think he's going to bring to the table for Michigan?
Yeah, I think the inside linebacker position last year was probably not talked about enough in terms of how good it was and how stable it was for Michigan, because part of that, I think, is due to the fact that Junior Colson is such a quiet guy. Like, he's just not a loud and boisterous personality. Even when he would make like an amazing play on the field or a great tackle, like, he was never the type to just go nuts with his celebration or anything. And so I think the combination of him and Michael Barrett, with Michael Barrett obviously being such an old and mature guy and had all the poise and everything to go with it, I just don't think there was as much flash or pizzazz from those 2 guys as they probably could have gotten away with given the quality and caliber of their play. So I think Barham is going to be a huge part of this defense, because you need somebody in the middle that can really communicate between the first level, meaning the trenches, and the third level, meaning the secondary. And when you look at the way he played in the spring game, like with a lot of violence and a lot of aggressiveness, and then you hear the way that Sharon Moore has talked about him throughout the spring. I think it was maybe his post-spring news conference where I wasn't able to attend, but you sent me the audio, so I appreciate that. And I was listening to it, and he basically said this is a guy that like doesn't really talk a whole lot and doesn't say much, but he's constantly going to work, constantly going about his business, and doing all the kinds of things that you used to hear people ascribe to Junior Colson when they talked about the way that he carried himself. And so I just think the combination of him and Ernest Hausman is probably about as good as Michigan could have hoped for when you have to replace 2 starting linebackers that both played like, I think it's at least 585 or almost 600 snaps, the 2 of them last year. So I think he's going to be a key piece of this defense. I think he's really athletic. I think he brings the experience and the tenacity and nastiness that new defensive coordinator Wink Martindale will be looking for. So I think he's going to be a key piece of this team. And then the other reason why I picked him is because, and this is part of the storyline, I think, of this team, is they just didn't bring in the same level of impact transfer necessarily as they did going into the 2023 season, when they had to remake that offensive line a little bit. When they brought in, I know this was a later addition, but bringing in a starting corner from UMass late in the cycle and Josh Wallace, I just didn't think there were as many impact guys coming in. And part of that is because of what we talked about earlier. They convinced some guys to come back and stick around and didn't need a ton of replacements other than the offensive side of the ball, which is obviously going to be almost completely redone. But the defense has key pieces at the first level and the third level already. And so I think if they can find the glue guy that meshes them together, and if that's Jayshawn Barham in the middle, I think he's going to have a really big year for Michigan.
It's funny, when he committed back in December, we probably didn't cover it. I'm speaking for myself here, as to the extent that we should have, because Michigan was gearing up for the college football playoff. And same with Josh Preeb. I mean, he committed while, we were on Pacific Coast time. It's like you wake up and it's like this kid committed. And then it turns out, wait, this guy's seems like a hell of an offensive lineman that'll start at left guard for Michigan this year. But, when he committed, I remember breaking him down and looking at what he did. And he played some edge rusher. Like, he's athletic enough to do that, go after the passer. Now with I'd say lack of depth at linebacker, it's pretty clear he's going to spend his time at middle linebacker. But with how aggressive Wink Martindale is, he's going to get his fair share of opportunities to rush the passer, I think, and get after guys a little bit. So I think that's going to be an interesting aspect of what he does as well, and something Junior Colson could do. Mike Barrett could certainly do as well. So I think some good parallels there. And then you wrote about this as well, the defensive back haul, I guess you could say, that Michigan gets. And, I think it was a 48-hour span, correct me if I'm wrong, that, they got 4 different defensive backs: Amir Hall, corner from Albany, 2 safeties, Wesley Walker from Tennessee / Louisville-ish, spent a semester there. Jaden Mangum from Michigan State, which took a lot of the headlines. Ricky Johnson seems like an insurance type of guy from UNLV, maybe add some depth if, break glass in case of emergency type of thing. But Michigan clearly had to do something, I think, with Rod Moore going down. They were looking for a corner going back to December, weren't able to land him. Now they get two. But Amir Hall really intrigues me out of Albany. Sharon Moore talked last week when we were there in Detroit about him being very similar in demeanor to Josh Wallace. And, I think he could be a similar type of impact guy for Michigan this year. You got Will Johnson on one side. You have Jair Hill, who I think they like, but he's inexperienced. But then you have an FCS All-American in Amir Hall that can come in and make a big impact.
Yeah, so one of the reasons I wrote that story about the secondary is because, generally if a team feels that it has a need at a position or a position group, what we've seen out of this modern landscape of college football is if they're going to address that need in the transfer portal, a lot of times the marquee guys are going in between that first and second semester, so kind of December, January, so that they can get enrolled by January and go through spring practice at their new school and everything that goes along with making that transition. So the fact that Michigan didn't do that, now I know the Rod Moore injury happened during spring ball, so that's not something that this coaching staff could have or would have anticipated in any way. But the fact that they went so heavy on the secondary after spring ball sort of made me think that they probably thought there were guys that would make bigger jumps in the spring than they did. And that's not to knock anyone on the roster, but generally speaking, if you're going out and adding 4 guys at one position group in the spring, that either suggests that you lost a bunch of guys in the spring due to injury or the portal, which Michigan really didn't, because other than Rod Moore, that was pretty much the only significant loss that they had in terms of guys that were likely to be in the rotation that they didn't already know about ahead of time, with obviously Keon Sabb being one of those guys that I mentioned that enrolled in Alabama in time to play in spring. So they already knew about that. But then if you're adding all these guys at the end, it kind of suggests like they wanted to go through spring. They thought maybe guys would make a jump, or they thought guys would be a little bit farther along than they were. And then it didn't happen. So they had to go out and either get depth pieces or guys that they think can be potential starters. And so I think Hall is absolutely the most interesting one, as you mentioned. The success that they had with Josh Wallace last year from UMass coming in late was really important to them, especially because when you think about what Josh Wallace was and what he wasn't, you guys have talked about this. I remember, Chris Ballas talking about this on the podcast with you many times about how, Wallace was never going to blow anybody away with physical traits. He wasn't a 4.4 burner. He wasn't a guy with a 40-inch vertical leap. He was just a smart, sound, experienced football player that could do a job, and you could scheme around him to cover up any of the weaknesses that he might have had. Now, obviously, it's going to be potentially even a bigger jump in competition for a guy like Amir Hall coming from an FCS level school. But you look at what Jared Verse did a number of years ago, going from Albany to Florida State and then becoming a first-round pick in this year's NFL draft. There is a lineage there, albeit a limited one, of guys going from that program, an established and well-respected FCS program, to bigger schools and making an impact. And I think this cornerback 2 situation is really one of the storylines to watch in fall camp when you look at the depth chart specifically, because everybody knows Will Johnson is going to take his side and he's going to lock it down and nobody's going to have to worry about that side of the field. But on the other side, if you don't have a number 2 corner that you love, then it starts to influence what you do with your safeties and what types of coverages you can play, because you may need to cover up some things or you may need to help a guy in certain situations. So I think the competition between Jair Hill and Amir Hall and Jaden McBurrows and Zeke Berry and anybody they might want to try at this perimeter corner spot, or even guys that can rotate through into the nickel, that's really intriguing to me. But what this secondary looks like outside of basically Makari Page and Will Johnson is really interesting to me, because I think even though Quentin Johnson has experience in terms of the years that he's been in school, he's still relatively unproven in terms of a game in and game out type of production. Number 2 corner, they don't really know what they have yet in terms of somebody that's shown it in a game setting. And then nickel, obviously, I don't think anyone's going to be able to play at the level that Mike Sanders still did last year. I think he was playing at such an incredible high level that it would be almost impossible to live up to that. But that's another position that they have to sort out. So other than Will Johnson and Makari Page, I think how this secondary shakes out and how many guys they feel comfortable cycling through is going to be really important to watch, especially in a year where their schedule has some more difficult games earlier in the year than what Michigan has faced the last couple of seasons.